Thanks so much to everybody who took the time out to watch my presentation. I'm so grateful and humbled that you guys would take a half hour out of your day to watch me talking to a camera. It was definitely a new experience for me, very awkward. And so I'm just grateful that for everyone who sat through that. And thank you so much. And thank you for those who submitted questions and talked to me about it. I'm going to boil down the questions to kind of two main themes and do my best to address them. The first theme is kind of if science and faith or scripture do not overlap and have a direct relationship, then how do they relate when in terms of ethics and scientific progress and different areas and avenues of science? How do Christian ethics come into it? And then the second one is about the fall and the doctrine of the fall, if we evolved and there is no historical Adam and Eve. The first one, and I hope I'm doing justice to those questions. I got several different ones, and so I just think that those are kind of the underlying themes. The first one about science and ethics, I think those are still worldview questions. I think that how science and faith relate in that instance is still a matter of prioritizing and then seeing it through the appropriate lens. It's separating them, that it's understanding that science is one avenue and faith is a totally different thing. And it's not about how do I make them relate, it's about prioritizing them and then looking through the lens appropriately. And so when it comes to ethics, I mean, I wish I had a black and white answer. I think everybody does. But I think the closest I've ever heard or have gotten to is that the gospel is nothing but pro-life. And I mean, much more than abortion and that controversy. So specifically, I got a question about cloning. And it's not that I think cloning necessarily itself, in and of itself, is wrong. It's more of the methodology behind it. One of the most helpful things I think I've ever heard is, about the pro-life, right? Is God is life, and anything that adds to life or to the abundance of life, that's what Jesus came to do. It's who he says he is. And while it doesn't quite create this black and white scenario, it does help narrow down the gray areas and help us navigate through the gray areas. Again, about cloning specifically, I don't think it's quite something that the church has to take a stance on, but rather continues to live an alternative lifestyle, right? Faith in scripture as a worldview is not just some heady academic field, though I do think biblical scholarship and ethics is, again, extremely helpful, and we put too much on our pastors when we want them to be experts on ethics as well. But when we see scripture and faith as a way of life, as a worldview, then that is how we begin to see science. And as a Christian doing science, I think your first question is, well, why do we even need to clone, right? Why do we need to do it? What's the purpose? What's the added value? I think it becomes superfluous, if I'm saying that word right, to the Christian scientist or to the one who lives out their faith as a way of life and brings it into science. Again, not a black and white answer. I get that, but hopefully that begins our navigation through these tough science and ethic questions. To the other one about the fall and the doctrine of the fall, this I find absolutely fascinating, and there are different models. Often in the readings, they'll call them biblical models, and I find that a bit ironic because they're actually scientific models. So even if if you're a young Earth creationist, then obviously you believe Adam and Eve were historical characters. Old Earth creationists, they would say that there's different things that they would say. That some would say that Adam and Eve were historical characters, and at some point God came and decided that Homo sapiens were advanced enough and complex enough and relational enough that they could bear His image, and He breathed on them, as it does say in Genesis, and that is when we became image bearers, and they were the first two. And it even helps that later on in Genesis we read Cain had many wives, and the question immediately becomes, well, where'd those women come from? And if you're an old Earth creationist, that plays into that, because Homo sapiens would still have evolved, but only Adam and Eve had the image of God on them. And so there were other women that maybe didn't have the image of God yet, or in other Homo sapiens in general, not just women. And then other old Earth creationists, and particularly maybe this is more the evolutionary creationists, which I kind of line up as, would see it that this was not a moment in time that God created Adam and Eve, or that there was a specific couple, but more so that this was a progression of God's handiwork and God's design through the evolutionary process, that we become image bearers through relationships. And the complexity of human relationships is on a whole different level, right, than any other animal in the animal kingdom. I recently listened to a podcast that I think is very helpful on this. It's called the Language of God podcast by Biologos. We're going to keep it at that. And it was an interview with Jane Goodall and Francis Collins. Jane Goodall obviously is the biologist and zoologist that worked with chimpanzees and everything. And she has some very interesting takes on how the chimpanzees have relationships as our closest DNA ancestors. But even with chimpanzees as our closest relatives, and even though they do have complex relationships comparatively to the rest, again, humanity is just so much more dynamic and so much more complex, with language and consciousness and different ways that we express ourselves. And so I think the image of God is more about our ability to relate than anything else. And so how does this relate to the fall? Let me get to that. Basically, our Jewish brothers and sisters do not have a fall doctrine. And I have very little hesitancy letting it go. I have no problem saying that the fall is a doctrine that we created at some certain point in history. There's a great book called Evolution in the Fall, edited by James K.A. Smith, if you want to read more on the topic. And he acknowledges, and I have to confront the fact that we should not do so lightly, that the fall is not a doctrine that you just say, oh, it's inconvenient, and so I want to get away with it. There's a lot of historical grounding in it and tradition around it. But if we read through Genesis and we see that, that there's a tree of life in there, therefore mortality was already part of the design. It does not talk about predation. It does not talk about animals eating other and hunting other animals. It doesn't talk about diseases and things. We just assume all of that because part of the curse is today you will surely die. And maybe Genesis doesn't say today, I shouldn't have said that, but he says now you will surely die, and obviously Adam and Eve do not die for another centuries later on. So I think, Genesis leaves room for the fact that even Eden itself was not this perfect paradise in the sense of nothing was wrong, or nothing was violent, or nothing was eternal, or everything was eternal. It leaves room for the fact that things did die, that things could have been hunting other things, that there could have been this violent process of survival of the fittest going on even in Eden. And then another podcast with the Bible Project that I reference a lot during my presentation, Tim Mackie offers this idea that, the people who wrote scripture either had memories of or heard stories of passed down to them of what it was like pre-civilization. And I think it was with that in mind that people wrote, and the ancient Israelites wrote Genesis and what we call primeval history, Genesis 1 through 11. Again, I know that was not a straightforward answer. If I had, let me try to summarize my answers here. Science and ethics, pursue life, right? That's honestly, I think the most helpful guide in terms of just Christian ethics in general. So it doesn't matter if we're approaching science or relationships or politics or whatever. And again, this is much bigger than just the abortion controversy and dialogue, but which I still think even pro-life nuances, there's just so much more to it than is typically talked about. But pursue life, whether that's in the sciences or in just your normal life or any role you carry. I think that's, and you only have one room in your memory bank for one guide. Do that. And then for the fall, quite frankly, I don't think that Genesis itself speaks of a fall, of a moment in time where humanity was once eternal and is no longer eternal, or immortal and is now mortal. I don't think that Genesis speaks of a moment in time where everything was perfect and now is broken. I think you can still have redemption and the need for reconciliation and the need for healing, fixing our broken world without a fall narrative, in the sense of in one moment in time everything went awry. I think we can still have this evolutionary kind of stance that we are, as opposed to doing a circular heading back to Eden, but rather that we are on a trajectory towards eternity, of which there's a new Jerusalem, a new Eden, a new heaven and a new earth. So again, thank you all for watching. I hope I faithfully addressed your questions. And if you have more, I'm happy to continue the dialogue. And I look forward to further conversations with all of you. So again, thank you for watching, and that's it. Thanks.